A fisherman is thrown overboard into the freezing Arctic, miles from land. Battling hypothermia, injury, and isolation, he washes ashore on a barren island. With no food, no shelter, and little hope, survival becomes a brutal fight against the elements. Will rescue come before the Arctic claims him? Ethan McAllister had been on the water since sunrise, the rhythm of the waves familiar, almost lulling. The Arctic air bit at his exposed face, but he welcomed the sting. It reminded him he was alive, out here where he belonged. He was alone, as he often preferred, piloting his small fishing trawler along the remote coastline of Baffin Bay. The season was changing, late summer giving way to the first whispers of fall. The waters were still mostly ice-free, but the chill carried a warning. Soon, winter would lock this place in its frozen grip. He had just checked the lines when it happened. A sudden jolt, a snap of tension from the winch. The rope, frayed from wear, gave way with a violent recoil. In a fraction of a second, it lashed across his shin, slicing through his pants and biting deep into his flesh. The pain barely registered before the force of the snap threw him backward. He reached, scrambling for the railing. Missed. Then, the gut-wrenching plunge. The Arctic water hit him like a hammer, stealing the breath from his lungs. His body seized, muscles locking in the shock of the frigid abyss. He kicked, desperate to resurface, breaking through with a choking gasp. His boat, his only salvation, was still under power, moving away. He lunged for it, but the distance grew too fast. His outstretched fingers grasped nothing but freezing air. He shouted, but no one was there to hear. The sound was swallowed by the vast, indifferent sea. Ethan fought the rising panic, forcing himself to think. His life had been built on survival, on instinct. He turned, scanning the horizon. There, a dark landmass against the slate-gray sky, an island, maybe 2 miles away. It was his only chance. Ignoring the burning in his leg, he began to swim. Each stroke was agony. The cold seeped into his bones, numbing his limbs, making them sluggish. His injured leg throbbed with each movement, but he couldn't stop. Not if he wanted to live. The island loomed ahead, growing closer with every strained breath. Waves tossed him, threatening to pull him under. He focused on the rhythm of his strokes, on the desperate need to keep moving. Minutes stretched into eternity. His body screamed for rest. But rest meant death. Finally, his feet scraped against something solid. He had made it. Staggering onto the shore, he collapsed onto the wet, icy sand. The wind howled around him, but the island was mercifully still. Gritting his teeth, he forced himself up. He needed shelter, fire, a way to tend to his wound. If he was going to survive the night, he had to act now. Ethan took his first steps into the unknown. Ethan stumbled inland, each step a battle against exhaustion and pain. The cold gnawed at him, his wet clothes an unforgiving weight. He scanned the landscape, rocky outcroppings, sparse driftwood, and patches of hardy moss. Shelter first. He found a shallow depression between 2 large boulders, partially shielded from the wind. It wasn't much, but it was something. His hands trembled as he searched his pockets, exhaling in relief when his fingers closed around the waterproof lighter he always carried. He gathered what little dry kindling he could find, twisted bits of moss, brittle grass, and fragments of driftwood. The first sparks died against the damp air. He struck again, and again. Finally, the tiniest ember caught, and he coaxed it to life, feeding it slowly. The flame flickered, wavered, then steadied. Warmth, hope. Next, his leg. Rolling up his pant leg, he grimaced at the gash. Deep, raw, sluggishly bleeding. Using strips torn from his undershirt, he wrapped it as tightly as he dared, wincing at the pain. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He sat by the fire, rubbing his hands together, watching the shadows stretch long against the rocks. The island was silent, save for the wind and the distant crash of waves. But something else lurked in the edges of his senses, an unease, a presence. Somewhere in the darkness, he knew, the Arctic was watching him back. The second night was the hardest. The fire, his only source of warmth, struggled against the relentless wind. Sleep came in fractured moments, his body never fully relaxing. Hunger gnawed at him, but the pain in his leg kept his thoughts sharp. He had to survive long enough to be found. On the morning of the third day, Ethan climbed the highest point on the island. He needed to do something, anything to increase his chances. Using rocks and driftwood, he spelled out a massive SOS on the exposed shoreline, hoping against hope that someone searching would see it. Hours passed, the cold sinking deeper into his bones. Then a sound, a distant rhythmic hum. He turned his head sharply toward the horizon, his heart hammering. A plane! It was far, almost too far. He stumbled toward the shore, waving his arms, shouting. The aircraft didn't change course, didn't slow. His gut twisted in despair as it disappeared over the horizon. He slumped against a rock, exhaustion crushing him. Had they seen him? Had they? Then another sound, fainter at first, then unmistakable. The low, powerful thrum of rotor blades. A helicopter! Ethan forced himself to his feet, arms trembling as he lifted them high. The chopper circled, then descended. A rescue team member was lowered, their voice muffled by the wind as they approached. He barely registered the harness being secured around him before he was lifted skyward, his body dangling over the frozen landscape that had nearly claimed him. As the island shrank below him, Ethan let out a slow, shuddering breath. He had endured. Against the odds, against the elements, he had survived. And as the Arctic faded from view, he closed his eyes, taking in the moment, knowing that he would never be the same again.